All right, so we're recording again. Thank you, Vicky. So now we're going into the second part of our day where we're going to be talking about designing engaging online and blended courses. Although we know our focus today is mostly for online learning, but these strategies can also be applied to our blended learning courses too, for those of you who are doing or planning to do in the future a mashup between classroom face-to-face instruction and online instruction. These principles apply to all. And whoever is not muted, if you could please mute yourself, that'd be great. Alrighty, so let's go into our agenda. We're first going to talk about designing for quality courses. Then we're going to talk about designing engaging courses. And lastly, designing equitable courses. So we're going to talk about those three components of design today. And then, of course, we'll get to the fun stuff, or as Marion called the dessert, with all the different tools and tips after this segment. So the top 5 factors Mary mentioned to us earlier for student success were satisfaction with online learning, that sense of belonging, support, time management skills, and quality of interaction and feedback. When it comes to design, design can actually play a role in a lot of those aspects. How satisfied someone is in a course can oftentimes have to do with how difficult or easy it is to navigate it, what it looks like, how it feels when they go into the course. It also can play a role into the community aspect because how you design your course and how you integrate that use of community or groups or pairing and buddying, as Miriam mentioned, plays a part of the design. Those time management skills also, how you design and develop your course, how you pace your course, plays into that, how you embed support into your course. Can they click a link to email and chat you really quickly or access tech support, or is it really hard for them to find that support? And then lastly, the quality of your interactions and feedback. How you set up your course really plays a role into how well you can respond to students. For example, if your course is set up to submit everything at the end of the week, that doesn't really give you a mechanism in which you can reply to each individual assignment depending on how you have those submissions coming in. Now, if you have them set up to be individualized, even if they're all due on the same day, it allows you to have feedback for each one of those individual courses. So just food for thought there. And then we talked about those barriers to persistence, right? The auditory learning style. How do we meet those needs? Well, we have to embed things that are specific to auditory learners and also to kinesthetic learners, visual learners, all types of learning styles. If Vicki, can you help Hortensia, please? And then difficulty in accessing the resources as well can be an issue. Again, if things are big, then it might be difficult for you to, for the student, I mean, to actually feel like they can get what they need. They might become frustrated if they can't find the resources or the textbook or the information they're looking for. Feeling isolated, again, if your course is not designed for group interaction or for frequent interaction and feedback with the teacher or facilitator, then that becomes an issue as well. Additionally, lack of access. And sometimes when we talk about computer access, we know some of our students don't have laptops or desktops at home. So we want to think about, is this thing that I'm using and asking my students to access, is it something they can use on their cell phones, the devices in their hands? Is it adaptable? Does it look the same? And so we want to be checking to make sure whatever we're asking our students to view and look at works on whatever device that they're on. Personal life barriers. Course design is not going to do a whole lot about personal life barriers, but when you set up your course, how you structure the timing of your course can. For example, if you have students at home who are homeschooling their children and you set up your course and your course is developed and designed in such a way that things are due at a specific time of day or their meeting times are very specific, will that work for their children's school schedule? Do they need to be off of the computer at a specific time so that their children can use it? Things of that nature. Additionally, when we talk about poor communication, if we're not giving that feedback, if we're not giving them guidance, if we're not talking to the students, if they're not hearing from us regularly, then they may not be persistent in the course. So that's another issue that we have there. So let's get into that why quality design really matters. So let's go into our first poll. And this is just a general question for each of you. When you think about site design, any site, I don't mean an online course, but in general, how much of a factor do you think design plays in how much people engage with content online? How much does site design play a factor in online engagement? So for example, if you're talking about a website, online shopping, if we're talking about online courses, anything online, how much do you think design plays a factor in how much a person will engage with it? So I see 22 of you. There's 50 of us, 50 of you online, so I'll give you a few more seconds to keep voting there. Great, thank you. So it looks like only one of you really thought not at all. But never mind, somebody changed the vote. One person said a little, and everyone else said a lot. And those of you who said a lot are 100%, well, not quite 100%, 94% accurate. What we found, what the researchers found when they were looking at design quality and how that affects online learning, they found that the first impression is almost the last impression. When people abandon websites within the first 30 seconds of clicking on it, a survey showed 94% of the time it was related to what the site looked like, the site design itself, that caused them to not want to go on that website anymore. So think about that for a second. When our students go to our online course, if they see what I call the scroll of death, and that's when you have everything that's all text, all laid out in one long page, and they have to just keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, that feels very overwhelming. That can feel very daunting and feel like I'm never going to get all of this done, right? So the first impression does matter, especially when we're talking about course design. We want our students to stay in the course, but if they feel overwhelmed or they feel like I don't want to even be in here, I don't like this environment, they won't stick with it. Good design solves a problem and it communicates a message. It lets us know exactly what the student is supposed to do or what's expected of them. If my student goes into a course, they should immediately see what those units are, where they are in the course, etc. It's really close.
Sudie, I'm sorry to interrupt. Your sound is very low, and it seems like there are some other people who are finding that the same. Is there a way you can turn that up a little bit?
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about that. Um, can everybody hear me okay? Can I get a couple of I can hear yous or turn it back ups in the chat? Everyone hear me okay? Okay, thank you, Nora. Thank you, Rain. Thanks, Belinda. Okay, so when we're talking about the engagement aspect, how much someone engages with content is very much connected to what it looks like, how visually appealing it is to them, because we're humans and that's just how things work. I see Francis and Rose have their hand up. Did either of you have a question and wanted to speak? Because you can do that if you would like. And I just put hers down. Rose put her hand down. Okay. Francis is typing. I'll wait for that response. Additionally, when a user has the ability to understand what they need to do and the experience is really welcoming and just feels good to the eye, right? It actually helps them achieve learning goals when they see things and it feels like something that they want to participate in, just like any other adult. If there's something we don't really like, we don't want to engage with it, right? So it helps them achieve their goals if they actually want to be in the course. And then the design can help inspire learners to take action. It should make them want to engage with the content, and then help learners to recall what they're learning. Right? Yes, exactly, Curtis. Ease of use, functionality. Those are really big tests to help with design. Exactly. So I have a question for you. Let me go to my next layout. What design aspects do you find most important? And put this in the chat above the slides, not in the general chat. What design aspects do you find most important in an online course? When you're thinking about an online course, whether you're creating one for your students or maybe you're taking an online class, what design aspects do you find most important? Okay, quality of material. And those of you typing in the general chat, please use the designated chat pod above the slides. Quality material, visual simplicity, yes. Is it fun? Exactly. Clarity of expectations, not much going on. And if anybody would like to actually share your thoughts about design and what that matters to you in terms of the course, please just raise your hand and we'll unmute you so you can speak. Engaging with a good flow, highly visual, clarity of expectations, and ease of finding materials, yes. Ben says, accessibility, not too much going on that would confuse the students. Wonderful. Quality and functionality, use of colors, that makes a huge difference. We'll talk a little bit about color usage in a minute. But yes, if it looks visually appealing, use of color. Aesthetic, easy on the eyes, yes. Easy to find information, I agree. Functionality, consistent layouts to make it easy to know expectations and due dates. I like that you mentioned consistency. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Aesthetics to the eye, easy to navigate. Yes, exactly. All of this. Clarity, clear and specific. Yes. Wonderful. Picture cues. Yeah, visual imagery and graphics are very helpful. Thank you, Claudia. Usability. Not look childish or cartoonish. Yes, I agree with that. Also, if we're using the older graphics like clip art, can make our courses look a little dated, which also makes them unappealing to the eye sometimes. Content developed based on what users want, not what we think they want. Yes, Nikki, thank you. Not making assumptions. Various ways to reinforce information, interactive with other student games and videos. I'd like that you said various ways to reinforce information, Kendra. That speaks to that providing information that's suitable to all learning styles. Thank you all for sharing. So we're going to move on to our next slide. So course design and layout, application of user-friendly technology. We want to, although Melinda's going to show us a lot of different tools and applications for this, but we want to think about, is the technology we're using user-friendly, especially if we're talking about our ESL students. We want to make sure they can access it and that it works in their native language so they can navigate it as well, right? So we want to make sure that we have a learning management system, something that allows us to track student engagement, track what they're doing, develop and customize, right? Webinars such as Adobe Connect, Zoom, GoToWebinar, that's some of the tools and technology we can use. And use of media, exactly like someone said in the previous question, graphics, video streaming, interactive media, apps like polls and quizzes. You can use YouTube to live stream to your students if you're not wanting to do something like Zoom going with all of them on camera at the same time. You can pre-record yourself. There are so many screen record applications out there, and again, Melinda's going to get into that, but there are so many different ways that you can integrate use of media, video, graphics, and things like that into your polls and your quizzes and your basic content so the students can really feel engaged. And we do this to provide structure, consistency, ease of access, but even with the best tools and applications, if we're not being intentional with that structure and consistency and with the ease of access piece, then that can still get lost. You can have the best, most expensive learning management system in the world and still end up with one page of ongoing content if you're not being intentional about the course design. We can't just throw everything on one page and hope it sticks. We want to make sure that when we're doing webinars, when we're doing, whether it's a pre-recorded session or if it's something you're doing live like we are right now, that there's interaction, there's engagement, that you can have the face-to-face time when necessary and needed. In this case, there's so many of us that would have totally bogged us down, but in a smaller class size, you can absolutely have everybody turn their webcams on so you can see them and they can see you. And that actually enhances that sense of community. And then it also enhances the course text and comprehension when we're using media. Like it addresses various learning styles, like we said. It provides something that's interesting for someone to look at, and it also helps them learn technical tools to use outside of the classroom. So for example, if they see you modeling these ways to implement different types of media and text and things like that into your lessons, when they're helping their children with their homeschooling aspects and they see their children aren't getting it, they can think to themselves, I can go look up a video or a graphic or something like that to show my child if they're more of a visual or an auditory learner too. So then the technology considerations you really want to take into account when you're designing is accessibility, number one. Do they have access to a computer? And if so, is it adaptable if they don't? For example, if I use something on say, Moodle, the online learning management system, that's something that I know if I develop it on the website, I can see it on my phone, but the way it looks on my phone is slightly different. So I want to make sure that however I'm setting it up, I'm checking it mobile and on the website so that I can see or on the website on my computer, so that I can see how this looks to my students from my students' perspective. We want to look at the system requirements and make sure it works on more than one platform. We don't know if our students are working from a Mac or from a PC all the time. And the argument that I've heard is, oh, well, our students are adult ed students, they're low income, they don't afford Macs. I've talked to students who have Macs because they saved up to buy one. But that doesn't make them high income. I've also have students who've been donated Macintosh computers. So make sure that whatever requirements that you have for the course content works on more than one platform. Will it work for students who have a Chromebook, for example, if that's what you're offering to have them use? Will it work on their mobile phones? Will it work for Android and Apple phones? Things of that nature. You want to make sure that whatever you're sitting out there works on multiple platforms. You want to make sure that the skills required and the support resource, that they have the skills or at least the resources to support them learning the skills, whether that's an orientation video you email to them that they watch, if it's the website and software and hardware information and instructions in a different language, things of that nature, so that if the student is a beginning ESL student, that they can still engage with the content, making sure that they have things accessible to them in their language. Sometimes for us as educators, that means we have to be a little bit more creative, and we might have to go seek out the instructions in a different language or use a translating tool and then have someone else proof that, because if we're using Google Translate, we know that does not always give a perfect match to other languages and things of that nature. And then we want to make sure we have the ability to easily access all tools and apps for anyone. We don't want to make it overly complicated and complex for our students to use the information. When it comes to course design and layout, additionally, we want to make sure that the visual appeal is consistent. We don't want from one unit to the next for things to be completely different. For example, if the resources are at the top of the course in Unit 1, don't put them at the bottom of the course in Unit 2, because the student's going to expect them to be at the top again. Make it consistent so they know where to find things. Make sure that there's white space. You don't have to completely fill every moment of every piece of space on the page with content. Make sure that it does, because that becomes overwhelming and looks daunting. So make sure it's not cluttered. Allow the white space to be there. It does help with making the course not feel like it's going to be too much and become frustrating. Limit the number of fonts. Try not to use fonts that use too many different fonts, for example. You don't want to use less than a 12-point font for people who can't see very well, like myself. You want to make sure you're using a sans serif font, like Arial or Tahoma, and those are the ones that don't have a lot of squiggly lines. They're easy to read. Make sure your instructions are very clear and understandable, whether that's recorded instructions. And if you do use recorded instructions, make sure you have something that has a text transcript so they can go back and read it without having to watch the video. Again, everybody's not visual that way. Some people like to be able to read and follow step by step. And then make sure there's a linear format or something that's pre-formatted if possible. If a lot of the learning management systems come with pre-formatted little modules and sections you can use, and some do not. But just make sure however you do it, it's consistent, it's easy to follow, and an easy flow. Any questions so far? Everybody following? Everybody can hear me? Okay, so moving on to the last piece relating to consistency. Again, user-friendly, consistent navigation, graphics with text description. I'm going to explain why that text description matters when we get to the equity section, but graphics with text descriptions are very helpful. Tables with titles, descriptions of the rows and column headers so the students know exactly what it is they're looking at. And slideshows that have slide titles and manual transitions, which means as they're going through it, they can click to advance at their own pace. So that they don't miss anything, or at least if it's a video that you recorded the presentation, make sure they have the tools available to go back and forth. Most video applications do allow for that, but sometimes when you embed a video, it auto-plays and it doesn't allow you to do that. So make sure, depending on which LMS you're using, that you're allowing for that either manual moving forward or backward or manual transition there. So any questions about quality and design and why that's important, or does everybody feel like, okay, this completely makes sense? These are things I kind of knew or was thinking about. How are we feeling so far? A few of you are typing. Got it. Okay. Thank you. Wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to, I forgot to mention, sorry about that. There are handouts on the left side of the screen. These handouts are related to this section. I'm sorry, left side, right side, bottom right corner of your screen. There's the PDF of these slides, but also a designing, engaging, and online learning checklist. You can go ahead and download those if you would like. If not, you don't have to have them on hand right now. I'm going to go through this, but I just want you to have that handout available to you. So there's 3 different types of checklists we're going to talk about, one of which we'll talk about in detail. The other 2 are really just checklists that support the first one. So this is the indicators of online learning, engaging online learning. It was actually based off of a rubric and a whole research-based practice and everything. I did in the PDF link the study if you want to go back and read it, but it's really, really informational. So the course engagement indicators are broken down into 3 sections. Instructional approach, that's your vision as a teacher of learning and what technology you intend to use. Teaching, that's the instructor's role, the tasks you're assigning, how you're grouping people, what instructional models you're using. And then learning, how you intend to assess the context of learning and what the student's role is in the course itself. And you really want to think about what the student role is in terms of what is it specifically that I want my student to be able to do, right? So I can hear pages turning. Whoever's not muted, please mute. Thank you. The instructional approach, the vision of learning. And again, this is in that handout at the bottom, so you don't have to worry about trying to read this all on the screen, but please feel free to download those handouts. So you want to think about who's responsible for learning. How is the learner going to be involved in their goal setting? How will you set those goals? For in some of your cases, because these are mostly students that you already had before COVID-19 came into effect, you may have already identified what those goals are. But for those of us who are open entry, open exit, or have students coming in all the time, and might be having new students coming in, it's a time now where we need to be able to establish those goals, but we're doing that online, right? So we want to make sure there's a mechanism for them to set goals, identify their goals, think about the tasks and assessments that go with those things, right? We want to be really strategic when we're developing these courses and think about how the learner is going to going to develop any sense of camaraderie with their classmates, with you as their instructor, strategies for, becoming, for changing and adapting whatever content you need to work on in an online environment. Because sometimes the things that we have that work really well in a face-to-face environment don't necessarily lend themselves to the online environment, so we need to think about how can I adapt this activity so it works online. Energizing the learning, whatever it is that you're doing, you want it to be something that compels the student to want to learn more, to take action, to do something, to kind of energize them into becoming passionate about solving whatever the problem is and about their learning. And then you want to make sure that it's collaborative so that the student doesn't feel like they're off floating in space by themselves every time that they're within the course. You want them to feel like they do have that sense of community within your course. And that's the collaboration with you and then also with their classmates. Then when we think about technology, we want to think about the interconnectivity piece. Does it allow the user to communicate in more than one way? Are they able to chat, email, call, do different mechanisms of communicating? Do they have access to challenging tasks? Sometimes it is easier to set up a course and then not make it as difficult for the student to do the task because it's easier for us to set up, right? So we might just set up a series of quizzes and then the quizzes might be just true or false, right? And that's not necessarily that rigorous, not that hard to solve, not that hard to figure out, like, okay, if I put true last time, I got it wrong, let me go back and redo it and put false, right? Because those kinds of quizzes are really easy for us to set up and develop. But that doesn't necessarily create a challenge or become thought-provoking for our students. So we want to make sure that we're being just as rigorous in our online courses and that we're actually challenging them and giving them stretch goals and pushing our students in the same ways that we would if they were in our classroom. We want to make sure that they still have access to learn by doing. So we want to make sure we give things like virtual field trips and things they can manipulate and play with, that they can actually go to the different simulators and things of that nature to learn, to manipulate, and to play with things. Sometimes it's a matter of just the gamification of education. A lot of people think educational games are only for children. They make educational games for adults too. And so you can integrate some of that and even create your own ways to gamify your courses. Maybe it's a matter of after they complete certain milestones in the course, we issue them badges, and then by the end of the course, they've collected 5 badges and they get one big one. And it gives students something to strive for, right? And then we also have media use, and we've talked about that quite a bit, but you want to make sure that you are using different types of media, whether it's images, videos, things of that nature, so that students can engage with the content and have some kind of a creative look into things. So let's talk about the instructor's role. That would be you. You're going to be engaged in negotiating, simulating, and monitoring all the things that happen within the class, right? And so you're going to be in those discussion groups. You're on those chat boards. You're replying to feedback on assignments. You're responding to them if they get stuck on something. That's all you. And so that sounds like a lot, but you want to make it in a way that it's easy for you to navigate. And a lot of online learning management systems, students can submit feedback and it comes to you, or submit an assignment, it'll come to your inbox on your email, and then you can just reply to that and they get it in their LMS. So you want to make sure that however you set this up, that it works for the students, but it also works for you and that you're not overly complicating your own life trying to reply and give them feedback. You want to make sure that you have the ability to guide students through the course from one task to the next or one unit to the next, and to make sure that they can construct their own meaning into what they're learning. But you also want to still have the opportunity to model the content or the activity or the way that you want them to be able to do things. And so sometimes that means recording ourselves, as much as we might not love being on video, to show the student how you do something, whether it's doing a math formula and recording yourself doing that, or if it's being online face-to-face and doing an online lecture with them where you demonstrate that, but recording it and posting it in your class so they can go back and refer to it later, things of that nature. And then you also want to treat yourself while you're in the course as a learner as well, because while we're in these courses, we're learning about our students, we're learning about their needs, about what types of assessments work well for them, about their learning styles, and you want to also learn about the different types of context and activities and things that work for your students and work for you. So as your students are learning this context and this information from you, you're also learning how to manipulate the technology to work best for the students. Curtis, do you want to hop on mic and share your thoughts? Curtis made a really interesting observation. He said from his experience, okay, go ahead. Let's unmute you so you can share that because I really think that's interesting. Go ahead. If you're speaking, Curtis, I can't hear you. Make sure your microphone button is turned green at the top of your screen. But what Curtis was saying is that our vision of learning may not align with a student's perception of learning, and balance must be taken into consideration to meet various students within their environment. And that's completely accurate. What we assume and perceive from our students or think that they need and make assumptions about what specifically their engagement is going to be like may not be the same way that they think of things. And so we want to make sure that we're trying to see things from their perspective as well, which is why when we have our checklist I'm going to show you in a second, we're not looking at it just from the teacher perspective, but we also want to take a moment to look at things from the student perspective and to survey the students and see how engaging they feel that the course is. Because sometimes we design something and we feel like it's perfect, it's going to be great, it's wonderfully engaging, and then the students engage with it and maybe they don't feel exactly the same way. So we want to make sure we're taking the time to understand from our students how they feel about things. And then moving into teaching, the last piece of teaching here, I think it's the last piece, is the tasks. Are they authentic? Does it pertain to real-world, meaningful, intellectual work, right? The same way we would do that in the classroom. Is it challenging, like we said earlier, and is it multidisciplinary? Does it help you solve a problem using more than one tool or using more than one piece of knowledge, right? And is it sustainable? Is it something that once they learn this thing, they can take it with them and they can then apply that to their later life, or they can build on that learning? So we want to make sure that we're considering all of these aspects. And again, these are things that we normally do in the classroom. We just want to take that into our online environment. And then grouping, we talked a little bit about that earlier. You can use heterogeneous groups, small groups with people who are different skilled so that they can help one another. Putting groups that are of similar skill and level together, especially if you're in a multi-level class, then you might want to group some of your lower level students together and your higher level students together. And then there's going to be certain circumstances in which it's more beneficial to the students to be paired with someone who is higher level than them, and then also for the other student as well. And you want to make sure that whatever groupings we do are flexible, so that if we need to group them a different way for a different activity, we can do that. So you don't want to make your groups structured in such a way that you cannot access it or that they cannot be changed. So you want to make sure that in the case where it's more beneficial to have students who are at the same level, the same learning style, etc., you can do that, but also make it flexible enough in which you can switch those groups around if need be. And then your instructional model that you use, like we said previously, it needs to be interactive, and it needs to be oriented towards providing meaningful experiences for the students. So let's get into the assessment component here and the learning piece. We want to make sure that assessments are performance-based, just as they would be in your classroom, not just based on memorization, but do they actually know how to use and apply the skills they learned, whether that's language, math, reading, career technical education and job application, things of that nature. You want to make sure that it helps them to produce meaningful information for the student, that it's seamless and ongoing, that it doesn't seem to take forever for them, like in a way that is frustrating, but in a way that they can continue the learning. So the assessment is transparent, they understand what it is, they understand how to do it, they know how that connects to their goal, and it's not something visually that looks like it's going to be very difficult to do. Even if it is a challenging task and it is rigorous, it doesn't have to feel daunting, it doesn't have to feel frustrating. And then we want to make sure it's equitable, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but we want to make sure that the assessment is culturally fair, that the questions we're asking are not things that people who grew up in specific neighborhoods would not know anything about. And then when we talk about the learning and context, we want to make sure, again, we have the opportunity to collaborate, formally collaborate in learning and developing that sense of community, but also so that students understand that collaboration mechanism and tool so that they can use it in their daily lives or in a future job. We want to make sure it helps us to build additional knowledge to solve problems and things of that nature. And then we can also assure that the ways in which we present information to our students also benefits, not necessarily benefits, but encourages empathy, right? So that our students can develop an understanding of themselves, of each other, value diversity, understand multiple perspectives, and things like that, so that they understand that their perspective isn't always the only perspective, the same as we have to understand that our perspectives are not the only perspective. And then when we think about the student's role in the context of learning, we want them to kind of be an explorer, right? We want them to be able to engage with, manipulate, dive into, and appreciate and enjoy their learning experience. And also push ideas and get them to think outside the box and do research and cite sources and understand informational texts and things of that nature. We want to make sure that they can also be in a situation where they allow mentorship, buddying, as Marian mentioned, that there's all kinds of different ways for them to grow within the course. Even if that means that the student is very advanced, let's pair them up with someone else and help them to teach another student, because learning by teaching, we know, is a very effective mechanism. Allow the students to lead from time to time, even if that means that they get to teach other students, right? And then allow them to produce things, whether it's being creative, if you're asking them to generate posters, make a newspaper flyer, make a flyer, make a press release, create a new cover letter, fancy up your resume and submit that online. All kinds of different things that you can do to allow students to flex their creativity muscle. Tell them, instead of submitting a PowerPoint for an assignment, to record themselves presenting it, right? So that you can actually get to see them and share that with the class. Or let them present online during a Zoom meeting or a Connect meeting such as this. So with all of these items, we have two checklists. And again, if you download the PDF of the slides you have, you can click the link. These checklists are intended, and I didn't share them in the pod because of the way it's structured on their website, but they're intended to give you two different lenses to look at this through. There's the faculty checklist, which would allow you to go through and I'm going to make this a little bit bigger for us for just a moment, which would allow you to go through and actually see how, make sure I have force presenter view here. There we go. Alrighty, so the faculty checklist here that allows your students to, or you to check and see how engaging your course was. It's built on all those factors of engaging learning environments that we talked about before, but this one actually is a complete checklist, so you can actually check it for yourself and see how well you're doing with that. And then when we go to the next one, there's a separate one that's specifically intended for students. And so when you go into that in turn allows you to survey your students and identify how engaging your course is from your student's perspective. So as Curtis alluded to earlier, sometimes our perceptions are not the same as our student. So just doing the faculty checklist is great, but if you add in a survey for your students to look at, then that'll also allow them the opportunity to give you feedback about how engaging your course actually is, right? Alrighty, so now I'm going to pause for a second. Does anybody have questions about the student engagement indicators? And again, you can download those handouts and the engagement handouts pod that's in the bottom right corner of your screen. Any questions? Everyone okay? All right, looks like everyone's following. So I'm going to go ahead. Someone's typing. Okay, good. Wonderful. Thank you for the feedback. Alrighty, so I'm going to go to our next chat. I think it's this one. There it is. Alrighty, so my question for you now is, when you think of equity in an online course, what inequities do you think students could experience in an online course? And use the chat pod directly above the slides where it says question and it has the question. What inequities do you think students could experience in an online course? Digital literacy, technology, different quality of technology, lack of proper equipment. My students don't have printers. Understand? Yep, that's accurate. Learning styles, internet access, poor audio. Kendra, ADA issues. Yes. Access to technology, access to internet equipment, private space while learning. Trustworthy equipment, lack of digital technical knowledge, not having the ability to access classes due to internet connection. Slow service, right? Especially in those rural areas. Language issues. Not having been exposed to educational information we're currently learning and would need step progression integrations. Good observation, Curtis. Thank you. Fear of technology. Language issues. Not having been exposed. Oh, I heard that one already. Constant learning environment. Consistent learning environment. Distance learning at home. Okay, so a lot of us are thinking about technology access and things like that. I did see one ADA comment that was up there. So when we're thinking about education equity, sorry, I'm just waiting for my layout to go back to normal. There we go. There's a couple of things we want to kind of check off, if you will, about whether or not our courses are equitable or if we're providing the type of information that we need. Are they available in more than one app store, right? Does it work? Will it work on their phone? Will it work if I'm getting it on Mac, Windows, Apple, Android? Does anybody still have a BlackBerry? Will it work on BlackBerry? I don't think anybody has those. But again, works in more than one app store, like I mentioned earlier. Does it work on various operating systems? And another thing I want to say here about operating systems is, are you providing instructions for more than one operating system? Oftentimes we're saying, okay, Kendra still has a BlackBerry. I am sorry, Kendra, for making the BlackBerry comment. Or maybe that you haven't upgraded. I'm just kidding. Kendra does have a BlackBerry. So yeah, does it work on multiple operating systems? Are you providing instructions in more than one? I was watching something the other day. It was a webinar, and I noticed that they said if you get lost to hit a button or whatever, which is really great to provide that information, how to get back to the webinar if something happens. But the instructions were only specific to Windows users. So if I was wondering to myself, well, what if I were on a Mac? How would I do it then? And I looked it up, and it is actually quite similar. But you want to make sure that when you're providing information, that you're providing information that applies to all the students in the class. Whatever you're asking them to do will require them to spend money. As a rule of thumb, if it requires students to spend money, I don't recommend it, because that means I'm creating an equity issue within my own class, because some students will be able to pay for it and others will not. Will the app work for English language learners? If it doesn't work for English language learners and you have English language learners in your class, then you need to make sure that you adapt an application that will. And that means the application can be converted to a different language. They can read it in their native language so they can still navigate it, especially for our beginning ESL students. Once they're a little further along, then yeah, it's really great to say, okay, if you're still using the app in Spanish, let's go ahead and switch it to English and let's see how we're doing. And if you're having trouble, we can switch it back and just, kind of help them with that. Is it accessible to those who are visually and hearing impaired? And when I say visually and hearing impaired, I do mean blind and deaf, but I also mean colorblind and hard of hearing. People who are colorblind, and I found this out the hard way. When I was teaching CTE, I created a Weebly website so my students could submit their assignments to me, and it was wonderful, except I had one student tell me they couldn't read the instructions on the submission page, and I didn't understand why, and he said it's because he couldn't see the text. It blurred into the background. And when I looked at it, I realized it was because of the color scheme I was using, right? So you want to make sure whatever colors you're using, while you do want to use color and add color and visual appeal to your site and to your class, you also want to be sure that you are using information that they can physically see. So make sure you're checking what types of colors you're using to make sure that they actually do work. And there are a lot of style guides online that'll help you with identifying what shades of red are hard to see against other shades, etc. So don't do what I did. Don't learn it the hard way. Make sure your students who are colorblind can still see. Make sure that whatever videos and things like that that you're using are captioned. In PowerPoint, there's a wonderful feature that allows you to turn on captioning while you're talking. And so you can actually give a conversation or a talk or a webinar or whatever and have it captioned for you. If you're using Zoom, there's a captioning feature in there as well. So make sure that you are using those caption features. Make sure you're tagging any pictures you put on your class with what the description of that class is, because if someone is blind and they're using a screen reader and you don't put the description of the picture, or you use the default descriptions that Windows or Microsoft sometimes give you that have nothing to do with what's actually on the picture. I, for example, looked up a picture, I think it was the one I used for agenda, and when I went to tag it, what was actually there was picture of food, and that was absolutely not a picture of food. So make sure that you are properly labeling things. And then Melinda mentioned algorithm-based factors, and I'm going to, I actually took that off, but exactly, algorithm-based factors for people with sight. There's a lot of different things relating to algorithms that actually can sort of increase its difficulties. And when we're talking about algorithm-based, we're talking about search functions, search engines, things like that that you can either use with your course or that you can use later. So again, you want to really think about that. And Melinda can talk more about the algorithm-based factors. Melinda, do you want to share right now?
Well, I would, but I typed astigmatism, so if it autocorrected,
You did,
I'm sorry. I have an astigmatism
sorry.
on my site.
Go ahead.
So,
sorry, just want to remind everybody
it's the same thing. Basically, it's the same thing with the color blindness almost. There are certain colors and what have you that you have to be aware of when you have an astigmatism, and I know that because I have it. So sorry.
Thank you, Melinda. She did say astigmatism. Yeah, and so there are algorithms, and we'll get to that in a second, that can actually cause issues within equity issues within the course, but also astigmatisms. If you have difficulty seeing, students who are hard of hearing need to have access to be able to adjust volume. Nothing is more frustrating than not being able to control a volume on your computer or device. So make sure, and normally students know how to turn the volume up and down and things like that, but if they don't, you may need to be able to have to explain to them how to do that or create a tutorial so they know how to adjust the volume so they can increase it when they need to and things of that nature. And then lastly, yes, being able to adjust audio speed, and some video players do not allow that and some do. Thank you, Kendra, for pointing that out. And lastly, thinking about, is it accessible to students in rural areas? If you're serving students who are in rural areas, you want to make sure that whatever you're providing to them can be downloaded for offline use, because that internet comes in and out. And so you want to be able to assure that they can access that, they can save it, they can get to it. So if they don't have internet connection, they can still have access to it. And then also thinking about, if they have no internet and they have no computer, what other options do we have for students? And I've seen things like teachers collecting packets and dropping them off and things of that nature. However you can do that, but you want to make sure that your rural students are being included in your planning process if that's who you're serving. And then the last piece I want to go back to about the algorithms, and that's before we take our break, which is a second. When it comes to algorithms, for example, when we tell students to go search for things and stuff like that, we want to make sure we're being very specific about what we're asking them to search for. For example, Google's gotten a lot better about it because Google recognized the bias in their own algorithms, but if you had gone and searched for CEO about 10 years ago on Google, you would have gotten all the same type of people, mostly would have been professional-looking males, right? But now if I go on Google and I research CEO, I get a more broad definition of what a CEO looks like. But if I do the same thing on different search engines, I don't necessarily get that. So you want to be specific about what you're asking them to look for. So instead of saying just CEO, say technology CEO. And then you'll find out that there are women, there are people of color, there's a lot of different people that are CEOs. You want to make sure the same way you're inclusive of culture and things like that in your classrooms on a day-to-day basis by your posters, your bulletin boards, all that great stuff, that you're also inclusive of that in your online course too. So you want to make sure that your students do feel represented within your classes. So I also provided a lot of resources and things for you if you want to go back and read and do some research into all of the things that I have mentioned today. So now, if nobody has any questions, does anybody have questions? I'd like to stop and ask if anyone has questions. Or does anybody want to open up their mic and share anything? Curtis has no questions. Anybody else have any questions? Okay, so it is stretch break time. So move away from your desk, stretch out, enjoy yourself for a few moments. And then when we come back at 11 o'clock, Melinda is going to take over. It's 11 o'clock.